When you write, it's a good idea to have different sentence structures to give your writing variety. This video will show you 4 different sentence patterns you can use to create more variety in your writing. These sentence patterns are created by combining clauses in certain ways. Let me take a minute to remind you of what a clause is. A clause is a group of words that has a subject and a verb working together. Generally, there are 2 types of clauses. There's the dependent clause, which cannot stand alone as a sentence. It needs something additional to make it a sentence. And there's the independent clause. This could stand alone as a sentence. So let's get started with our first pattern, pattern number 1, known as coordination. This chart may seem a little daunting at first, but really every row represents the same thing. On the left we have an independent clause, highlighted in red, and on the right we have an independent clause as well. Those clauses are joined with a comma and a coordinating conjunction. If you can't remember what a coordinating conjunction is, many of you may have learned it as something called fanboys. Because it's an acronym for the words, if you read from top to bottom, you can see the word fanboys in red. It's also important to note that that comma that's there right before the fanboy or the coordinating conjunction is really super important. Don't forget that. Let's take a look at this pattern in action with some examples. Go ahead and read this example. As you can see on the left, we have an independent clause. Being a zombie has many disadvantages. This could stand alone as a sentence. And on the right, we have an independent clause as well. It also has some advantages. This also could stand alone as a sentence. These 2 independent clauses are joined with a comma and a coordinating conjunction. Here's another example. Take a moment to read it. On the left, we have an independent clause. There is a wasp that lays its eggs inside a cockroach. We also have another independent clause. The larvae then eat the cockroach alive. These 2 independent clauses are joined with a comma and a coordinating conjunction. Incidentally, there really is a wasp that does this to the helpless cockroach. Now let's take a look at pattern 2, which uses conjunctive adverbs. And don't get all frustrated with the grammar speak of conjunctive adverbs. Let's just take a look at the pattern. Here we have an independent clause on the left and an independent clause on the right. This is just like the example before, but in this case we're using adverbs. Notice these words are different than fanboys. In addition, notice that the punctuation is different than in pattern 1 as well. In pattern 1 we used a comma, but in this particular instance we use a semicolon instead. As is often the case, it helps to look at examples. Lethologica is a really cool word, however, I can't remember what it means. Here we have an independent clause. Lethologica is a really cool word. We also have another independent clause. I can't remember what it means. And that's joined with a semicolon and the word however, followed by a comma. Here's another example. Take a look. The first independent clause is the Adobe document is interactive. The second independent clause, you can fill in the form right on your computer screen. This too is joined with a semicolon, the word therefore, followed by a comma. This brings us to pattern 3, which uses subordinating conjunctions. Now this pattern is slightly different than the first 2 that we saw. Here we have an independent clause on the left, but on the right we have a dependent clause made up of both the subordinating conjunction and whatever you wrote afterwards. Notice also that there's no punctuation between the independent clause and the dependent clause. That's always the case when the independent clause comes before the dependent clause. Notice also the words are subordinating conjunctions, not the fanboys. I've included a few examples. Take a look at this first one. We have an independent clause on the left. The boats left the marina. And we have a dependent clause on the right beginning with a subordinating conjunction because. Here's another example. Have a dependent clause on the left. Don't be surprised to see a blue lobster. This is followed by a dependent clause on the right that begins with a subordinating conjunction, the word since. This brings us to our final pattern, again using subordinating conjunctions. However, this time around, the subordinating conjunction comes at the very beginning of the sentence. So now we have a dependent clause at the beginning of the sentence, followed by an independent clause at the end, and there's a comma separating the two. So when the dependent clause comes before the independent clause, we need that comma. Again, let's take a look at a few examples. In this example, the first part of the sentence is a dependent clause. It cannot stand alone as a sentence. Although you can learn a lot on YouTube, it seems to go nowhere. The second part is an independent clause. And notice they're joined with a comma. Here's another example. This one I like. Because teachers told you not to start a sentence with because is a dependent clause starting with the subordinating conjunction because. The next part is an independent clause. Note that they're joined with a comma. Although there are many ways to combine sentences, the 4 patterns outlined in this video will serve you well. And if you're paying attention, you'll notice that here in this example, I have a dependent clause followed by an independent clause, and that those two clauses are separated by a comma. This is a perfectly good sentence.